about writing in general, and for me about poetry. So I think that like the thing about narrative poetry that's like complex and hard for me is that you know, there's a story is a story, right? A story is a story, and that's fiction. But then when you bring a story into poetry, it's like a new environment for a story. So I think it's exciting for me because I feel like you can break a lot of rules in poetry that you couldn't necessarily, it's harder to break when you're writing like a short story or a novel. Like I like to jump back and forth in time, you know, I like to, you know, spread time out in a way. I like to kind of ignore the laws of space and time in a way and just kind of leave gaps and leap from thing to thing. I think that in poetry, one of the things that's really great is that you can leave big blanks, you know, and let the reader fill those blanks in with their imagination. And I think that really opens up a whole world for the poem. Like you can have a poem that's really short, but because of what you've placed in there and what you've left out, now there's a whole world inside that poem. Because in between those elements that you've placed in, there's space for the reader to think like, wow, like how did we get here? What does this mean? And I think that's one of the beautiful things about poetry, because I think that more than any other narrative form, it's really this like participation, it's a participatory act, like the reader and the writer, where the reader is doing a lot of work as well, figuring out how they feel about this work and what's happening in the spaces between the words and what that writer is reaching for. So that's one of the reasons why I think poetry is really exciting, and I think that narrative poetry can really do something special, and that's what I like to try to do with my work. And you know, another thing is like, aside from stealing stories from other people, more recently I've tried like stealing my own stories. For a while I really shied away from doing that, but lately I've been kind of entering more into that and trying out more ways of telling my own story. Like genealogy, for example, you know, that's a little bit about me, and it's a little bit about everybody. I'm Jamaican, that's where my family is from, and thinking about my own history, and you know, for an immigrant like me, you know, I don't know a whole lot about. I can't trace my family back to the Mayflower, for example, and I think that's true for probably a lot of people in this room. And I think thinking about that lack of history, that blank, and I'm thinking about that is what led me to write the poem Genealogy. And also, I think I try to, when I'm writing it even about myself, I try to think about what does this story mean for me, and how do I place the story in a larger context of like any human being, anybody in America or anywhere. And I try to open it up, like zoom out from my own life, and open up the experience so that anybody who's reading this can understand it and relate to it and get something from it that maybe I didn't even intend, but something that maybe it means something different to them than it means to me. You know, maybe they can relate to my experience, or they've taken something else from it, and that's exciting for me as well. So those are like few different ways that like I like to approach narrative and writing. And sometimes in my stories, very little happens, and sometimes a lot happens. But whatever I'm doing, I really try to take full advantage of the form and put some music into it, you know, repeat things, put some rhythm into it that I think enhances the meaning, enhances the story, and ultimately I really want it to be an experience where the story that I'm telling is flexible and open enough that it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and that's what I aim for in my own work. So, do you guys have any questions? Don't be shy.
Yeah. Do you have any rituals when you write? Like, do you have a habit that you do every day, or is it more impulsive?
Oh, I wish I had a habit that I do every day.
Did everybody hear the question?
Oh, she's asking if I have any rituals when I write, if there's something that I do every day, or if it's more impulsive. And I think I'd like to be the kind of writer where I sit down every day in the morning and I'm just like, I shall now bequeath unto the page, you know, but I can't do it. I can't do it. I find that, you know, one of the things about juggling being a poet and a writer and also having a life that involves a regular desk job is that I have to, even though my instinct is to be impulsive and to stay up all night one night, just like, tonight I'm going to write some poetry, you know, I have to because I want to take this seriously, I myself personally find that it's helpful for me to try at least to be the kind of writer who sits down every day and looks at the page at least and tries to do something with it. And I don't always meet that goal, but I think that I find that like the act of thinking about that and having that be my goal helps me to produce more writing. And maybe I'll only sit down and write once a week, or maybe I'll sit down 3 times in a week and I won't write any poetry, but I'll think about my manuscript. I'm trying to finish a manuscript right now, and I'll think about, oh, maybe I should send some of these poems to this journal that I want to be published in, or maybe I should apply for this artist residency somewhere, and I'll just think about, sit down at least a few times a week and think about my writing life and where I am with it. And sometimes that'll involve actually writing poetry, and sometimes it won't, but I try to at least have that goal. Other questions? Yeah?
Did you always or ever read a lot of poetry? I mean, was poetry the kind of thing that spoke to you more than other kinds of writing, and you still do that, right? Who are the people who do that?
Yeah. Well,
can you stand up and say your name?
Oh my gosh.
Shout out the question, sorry.
My name's Julie Solomon, and my question is, do you read a lot of poetry? Have you always read a lot of poetry, and was that the kind of writing that spoke the most clearly to you?
Mm-hmm.
And who do you like to read? I mean, just sort of a general.
Yeah. So, I have always been a voracious reader since I was a kid. I loved reading. I was like, can I just have a job where all I do is just read books? I still wish I could do that. I still wish that were a job. I'm pretty close to it as a teacher right now, but I didn't read poetry at first. At first I was reading a lot of novels. And then I came to poetry. I mean, I wrote a few poems. My dad is another person who really loves literature, and he would introduce me to poems here and there. But I found that I really expanded my reading life in college when I was able to take, because you know when you're in high school, I would read a few poems here and there, but the curriculum was, I love that sound. I was like, someone's farting really loud. No, thank God it's not that. But I found that in high school. It's you. Alright, got me. This morning. So in high school, I was reading. The poetry that I was reading was, I think, like a little bit more difficult to relate to, because there wasn't a lot of contemporary poetry that you were being given as a high school student. For me, anyway, a few here and there, but. In college, I was really able to start reading what was happening right now. I think like it can be difficult to break into that because when you're not a person who's really involved in the poetry world, you don't know where to start. But it was nice to have that, to have people giving me books and say, here's a place to start. So that was when I really started reading, getting into contemporary poetry a lot more. And now I read a lot of poetry. I read journals, I read books. Some of my favorite writers right now are Mary Jo Bang, Yusef Kominyaка, Sylvia Plath, who is a writer of the past, that I also really love, John Berryman. I mean, there are a lot of people that I really enjoy, and I read work. Mostly now I'm reading contemporary work, just because there's so much going on in contemporary poetry right now. And I think it's important as a poet writing today to both have an awareness of the poetry of the past and engage with the poetry of the present and know what's happening and be able to have a conversation and dialogue with that for yourself to help define what you want to do and to engage with what's happening today as well. Yeah, in the very back there.
My name is Tatiana, and I would like to know, how did you come up with, or how can you explain the structure?
Well, for me, it's a pretty organic process. I have taken some classes on writing in form where there's a strict structure, and now I find that I'll start to feel a rhythm of a poem and I'll just follow it. So, and it's something that I've been working on for a while and developing, but there's never really a strict structure for my poems, and they vary from poem to poem, the way that they're laid out on the page, the rhythm of them, the pace. It varies a lot. So for genealogy, for example, there's a lot of repetition in that, and I felt like, as I started writing it, I felt the sort of music of it, and I just followed it, basically. So if I were to try to take it apart, I wouldn't even know how to take it apart and explain the structure of that. But I find that what I do is, as I start to write, I feel like, well, I think this poem is going to have a musical feel. I feel like this poem's going to have a lot of repetition. Or I feel like this poem, what calls for in this poem is a lot of space. It's going to be slower. It's going to be shorter lines because the subject of this poem feels to me like that's what would fit best with it. So basically, from poem to poem, I kind of gauge based off like the language and like the subject, how I want it to look and sound, and how quickly I want it to move. And I think that's the best way I can explain the structure. Yeah?
Hey, my name is Lindsay. I'm in awe of people who can write poetry in the first place. But I'm curious, after you've written a poem in a really organic way, and the poem is full of images that are personal to you and feelings that are personal to you, are there ways that you can go back and edit a poem and make a poem better after you've written it?
Oh, yeah.
And would you mind talking about how you improve poems after you've already set them down?
Yeah, I think that's like one of the hardest things for me, and probably for a lot of writers. I actually feel for people who write novels because I feel like, whereas with a poem you can just sit there with like one little page and just go over it obsessively. With a novel, wow, that's gotta be rough. Sorry guys. That's crazy. No, I'm in awe of those. I'm in awe of novelists. I'm like, that's so many words, you know. But for poetry, it can be really difficult, and I find that, again, it's almost an organic process, but when I look at a poem, I think one of the things you learn as a poet and as a writer is to know when something's done and to know when something needs to be improved. And I think that's one of the things that going to school and taking creative writing classes in college and in graduate school has helped me figure out for myself, so I don't have to have someone telling me, like, this is not working. So I'm looking at a poem, and sometimes it comes out, and I'm like, oh, this is really good, I'm liking how this is looking, I'm going to make a couple of edits. And sometimes it comes out and I'm like, it's just not the poem that I want it to be. And for me, it's a matter of reading it and reading it and reading it. And a lot of times, I'll move the order around. Sometimes there's a line that I started with that I'm in love with that needs to be gone. And that happens a lot. I think, you know, murder your babies or something is like a common phrase you hear in workshops because sometimes you fall in love with a line and like the line does not belong in the poem, but you really love it, and it's like, well, it's gonna have to go somewhere else. That happens a lot. I reorder a lot of the time. Sometimes I find that if I know what I'm trying to say in a poem, I say too much and I need to cut back. Sometimes I wrap the poem up too tightly in a little bow, and I need to like loosen a little bit to let a little bit more air and light in and imagination in. But I find that the process for me is basically reading it again and again, and coming back to it again and again, and stepping away from it for a while sometimes, especially if I'm having a difficult time getting it to where I want to be. And eventually what happens for me is that I come back to the poem and I don't cringe, and I'm like, I look at it and I think this poem is saying and doing what it should be saying and doing. Whether or not I love it or hate it, I think like that's where it needs to be. So that happens to me a lot. And I have produced poems where I'm like, I think it's done, but I'm not in love with it, but it's done. And my happiest moments are when it's done and I'm in love with it. So, yeah.
We have time for maybe 10 more.
Any other question? Last question?
No, you go. I've already asked.
Well, actually, expanding on that, when you started writing,
If you could just, sorry, you can stand up and say your name first.
I'm Linda. So when you started, you said early on,
Yeah.
it wasn't only until, did you always think that things were perfect, and then when you got to college, you kind of started having other eyes on it, or how did more on that editing?
Yeah, I think the process for me was the more I knew, it was like kind of a parabola of self-criticism, sort of like, and that spiked sort of probably in college where I was like, oh my gosh, everything is awful. And when I started, I was like, I'm a genius, like, gold, you know, and I was really excited about it because I just never, because people were encouraging me and I had never really thought of myself this seriously before, and so I was really excited, you know, I'm sure like, now looking back, I'm like, okay, like, I had some stuff to learn. But when I started reading more and more poetry, that's, I think, when I felt the most frustrated with my own work. Because I sensed how much growth there was still left to do. But I found that, like, the more I wrote and the more I read, the more comfortable I was with my own voice, and the more flexible I was, and the more willing I was to take risks. And I also found that the more I read and the more I wrote, college to write a certain kind of poem, or to write a poem that's going to please a certain kind of person. So I was allowing myself, after that experience, to really expand and just be who I wanted to be in my writing, which I think is a great place to be. But I think it's also necessary to go through that period where you are really examining yourself and criticizing yourself, not to the point where you stop writing, but to the point where you're like, I'm going to improve, and I'm going to be like the best writer in